The Trial. Franz Kafka. Part 4.
The Trial. Franz
They
Kafka.
still had not arrived
Part
at the
4.
top, however, when the painter up above them suddenly pulled the door wide open and, with a deep bow, invited Kay to enter. The girls, on the other hand, he tried to keep away. He did not want to let any of them in, however much they begged him, and however much they tried to get in. If they could not get in with his permission, they would try to force their way in against his will. The only one to succeed was the hunchback when she slipped through under his outstretched arm, but the painter chased after her, grabbed her by the skirt, span her once round, and set her down again by the door with the other girls, who, unlike the first, had not dared to cross the doorstep while the painter had left his post. Kay did not know what he was to make of all of this, as they all seemed to be having fun, one behind the other. The girls by the door stretched their necks up high and called out various words to the painter, which were meant in jest, but which Kay did not understand. And even the painter laughed as the hunchback whirled round in his hand. Then he shut the door, bowed once more to Kay, offered him his hand, and introduced himself, saying, "Titterelli, painter." Kay pointed to the door, behind which the girls were whispering, and said, "You seem to be very popular in this building." "Ah, those brats," said the painter, trying in vain to fasten his nightshirt at the neck. He was also barefooted, and, apart from that, was wearing nothing more than a loose pair of yellowish linen trousers held up with a belt, whose free end whipped to and fro. "Those kids are a real burden for me," he continued. The top button of his nightshirt came off, and he gave up trying to fasten it, fetched a chair for Kay, and made him sit down on it. "I painted one of them once. She's not here today, and ever since then they've been following me about. If I'm here, they only come in when I allow it, but as soon as I've gone out there's always at least one of them in here. They had a key made to my door and lent it round to each other. It's hard to imagine what a pain that is. Suppose I come back home with a lady I'm going to paint. I open the door with my own key and find the hunchback there or something by the table, painting her lips red with my paintbrush, and meanwhile her little sister will be keeping guard for her, moving about and causing chaos in every corner of the room. Or else, like happened yesterday, I might come back home late in the evening. Please forgive my appearance and the room being in a mess. It is to do with them. So I might come home late in the evening and want to go to bed. Then I feel something pinching my leg, look under the bed and pull another of them out from under it. I don't know why it is they bother me like this. I expect you've just seen that I do nothing to encourage them to come near me. And they make it hard for me to do my work too, of course. If I didn't get this studio for nothing, I'd have moved out a long time ago." Just then a little voice, tender and anxious, called out from under the door, "Titterelli, can we come in now?" "No," answered the painter. "Not even just me by myself?" the voice asked again. "Not even just you," said the painter, as he went to the door and locked it. Meanwhile Kay had been looking round the room. If it had not been pointed out, it would not have occurred to him that this wretched little room could be called a studio. It was hardly long enough or broad enough to make 2 steps. Everything, floor, walls, and ceiling, was made of wood. Between the planks narrow gaps could be seen. Across from where Kay was, The
The
bed
bed
stood
stood
against the
against the
wall
wall,
under a
under a
covering of
covering of
many
many
different
different
colors.
colors.
In the
In the
middle
middle
of the
of the
room
room,
a
a
picture
picture
stood on
stood
an
on an
easel,
easel,
covered
covered
over
over
with a
with a
shirt
shirt
whose
whose
arms
arms
dangled
dangled
down to
down
the
to the
ground.
ground.
Behind Kay was the window, which the fog made it impossible to see further than the snow-covered roof of the neighboring building. The turning of the key in the lock reminded Kate that he had not wanted to stay too long, so he drew the manufacturer's letter out from his pocket, held it out to the painter, and said, "I learned about you from this gentleman, an acquaintance of yours, and it's on his advice that I've come here." The painter glanced through the letter and threw it down onto the bed. If the manufacturer had not said very clearly that Titorelli was an acquaintance of his, a poor man who was dependent on his charity, then it would really have been quite possible to believe that Titorelli did not know him, or at least that he could not remember him. This impression was augmented by the painter's asking, "Were you wanting to buy some pictures, or did you want to have yourself painted?" Kate looked at the painter in astonishment. What did the letter actually say? Kate had taken it as a matter of course that the manufacturer had explained to the painter in his letter that Kay wanted nothing more with him than to find out more about his trial. He had been far too rash in coming here. But now he had to give the painter some sort of answer, and glancing at the easel, said, "Are you working on a picture currently?" "Yes," said the painter, and he took the shirt hanging over the easel and threw it onto the bed after the letter. "It's a portrait, quite a good piece of work, although it's not quite finished yet." This was a convenient coincidence for Kay. It gave him good opportunity to talk about the court. As the picture showed very clearly, a judge. What's more, it was remarkably similar to the picture in the lawyer's office, although this one showed a quite different judge, a heavy man with a full beard, which was black and bushy and extended to the sides, far up the man's cheeks. The lawyer's picture was also an oil painting, whereas this one had been made with pastel colors and was pale and unclear. But everything else about the picture was similar, as this judge, too, was holding tightly to the arm of his throne and seemed ominously about to rise from it. At first Kay was about
About
to
to say,
say, "He certainly is a judge," but he held himself back for the time being and went closer to the picture as if he wanted to study it in detail. There was a large figure shown in the
there
middle
was a
of the throne backrest which Kay could not understand, and asked the painter about it. "That'll need some more work done on it," the painter told him, and taking a pastel crayon from a small table, he added a few strokes to the edge of the figure, but without making it any clearer, as far as Kay could make out. "That's the figure of Justice," said the painter finally. "Now I see," said Kay. "Here's the blindfold, and here are the scales. But aren't those wings on her heels? And isn't she moving?" "Yes," said the painter. "I had to paint it like that according to the contract. It's actually the figure of Justice and the Goddess of Victory all in one." "That is not a good combination," said Kay with a smile. "Justice needs to remain still, otherwise the scales will move about, and it won't be possible to make a just verdict." "I'm just doing what the client wanted," said the painter. "Yes, certainly," said Kay, who had not meant to criticize anyone by that comment. "You've painted the figure as it actually appears on the throne." "No," said the painter, "I've never seen that figure or that throne. It's all just invention. but they told me what I had to paint." "How's that?" asked Kay, pretending not fully to understand what the painter said. "That is a judge sitting on the judge's chair, isn't it?" "Yes," said the painter, "but that judge isn't very high up, and he's never sat on any throne like that. And he has himself painted in such a grand pose. He's sitting there just like the president of the court." "Yeah, gentlemen like this are very vain," said the painter, "but they have permission from higher ups to get themselves painted like this. It's laid down quite strictly just what sort of portrait each of them can get for himself. Only it's a pity that you can't make out the details of his costume and pose in this picture. Pastel colors aren't really suitable for showing people like this." "Yes," said Kay, "it does seem odd that it's in pastel colors." "That's what the judge wanted," said the painter. "It's meant to be
The
for
judge
a woman." The sight of the picture seemed to make him feel like working. He rolled up his shirt sleeves, picked up a few of the crayons, and Kay watched as a reddish shadow built up around the head of the judge under their quivering tips, and radiated out to the edges of the picture. This shadow play slowly surrounded the head like a decoration or lofty distinction. But
but
around the
around the
figure of
figure of
justice,
justice,
apart
apart
from
from
some
some
coloration that
coloration
was
that was
barely
barely
noticeable,
noticeable,
it
it
remained
remained
light.
light.
And in this
This
brightness,
brightness,
the
the
figure
figure
seemed to shine
shine
forward,
forward,
so that it
so that
now
it now
looked
looked
like
like
neither
neither
the God
the
of
God of
justice
justice,
nor the God
the
of
God of
victory.
victory.
It
It
seemed
seemed
now
now
rather to
rather
be a
a
perfect
perfect
depiction
depiction
of the God
of the
of the
God of the
hunt.
hunt.
Kay
He
found the
found the
painter's work
painter's
more
work more
engrossing
engrossing
than he had
than he
wanted
had
to.
wanted to.
But
But
finally he
finally, he
reproached
reproached
himself for
himself
staying
for
so
staying
long
so long
without having
without
done
having done
anything
anything
relevant to his own
relevant to his own
affair.
affair.
"What's the
What's
name
the
of this
name of this
judge?" he asked
judge? He asked
suddenly.
suddenly.
"I'm not
I'm
allowed to
not
tell
allowed
you
to tell
that,"
you that.
the painter
The painter
answered.
answered.
He was
He
bent
was
deeply
bent
over the
deeply over the
picture,
picture,
and clearly
clearly
neglecting his
neglecting his
guest,
guest,
who,
who,
at
at
first,
first,
he had
he had
received with
received
such
with such
care.
care.
Kay took
He
this
took
to
this
be
to be
just a
just a
foible
foible
of the
of the
painter's, and it
painters, and it
irritated
irritated
him
him
as it made
as
him
it made
lose
him lose
time.
time.
"I
I
take it to
take it to
you
you
must be a
must be a
trustee of the
trustee of
court,"
the
he
court,
said.
he said.
The
The
painter
painter
immediately put his
immediately put his
crayon down,
crayon down,
stood
stood
upright,
upright,
rubbed his
rubbed his
hands
hands
together, and
together,
looked at
and looked
Kay
at
with a
Kay with a
smile.
smile.
"Always straight
Always
out with the
straight out with
truth,"
the
he
truth,
said.
he said.
"You want to learn
Want to learn
something about the
something
court
about the
like it
court
says
like
in
it
your
says in
letter
your
of
letter of
recommendation.
recommendation.
But then you
But then
start
you
talking
start
about
talking
my
about my
pictures to get
pictures
me
to
on
get
your
me on your
side.
side.
Still, I
Still,
won't
I
hold it
won't hold it
against you.
against you.
You weren't to
You weren't to
know that
know
that
that
was
that was
entirely the wrong
entirely the
thing
wrong
to try
thing to
with
try
me."
with me.
"Oh,
Oh,
please,"
please,
he said
said
sharply,
sharply,
repelling Kay's
repelling Kay's
attempt to make
attempt to
some
make some
objection.
objection.
He then
He then
continued,
continued,
"And besides, you're quite right in your comment that I'm a trustee of the court." He made a pause as if wanting to give Kay the time to come to terms with this fact. The girls could once more be heard from behind the door. They were probably pressed around the keyhole. Perhaps they could even see into the room through the gaps in the planks. Kay forewent the opportunity to excuse himself in some way, as he did not wish to distract the painter from what he was saying, or else perhaps he didn't want to get too far above himself, and in this way make himself to some extent unattainable. So he asked, "Is that a publicly acknowledged position?" "No," was the painter's curt reply, as if the question prevented him saying any more. But Kay wanted him to continue speaking, and said, "Well, positions like that aren't
officially
officially acknowledged can often have more influence than those that are." "And that's how it is with me," said the painter, and nodded with a frown. "I was talking about your case with the manufacturer yesterday, and he asked me if I wouldn't like to help you, and I answered, he can come and see me if he likes, and now I'm pleased to see you here so soon. This business seems to be quite important to you, and of course I'm not surprised at that. Would you not like to take your coat off now? Kay had intended to stay only for a very short time, but the painter's invitation was nonetheless very welcome. The air in the room had slowly become quite oppressive for him. He had several looked in amazement at a small iron stove in the corner that certainly could not have been lit. The heat of the room was inexplicable. As he took off his winter coat and also unbuttoned his frock coat, the painter said to him in apology, "I must have warmth. And it is very cozy here, isn't it? This room's very good in that respect." Kay made no reply, but it was actually not the heat that made him uncomfortable, but much more the stuffiness, the air that almost made it more difficult to breathe. The room had probably not been ventilated for a long time. The unpleasantness of this was made all the stronger for Kay when the painter invited him to sit on the bed while he himself sat down on the only chair in the room in front of the easel. The painter even seemed to misunderstand why Kay remained at the edge of the bed, and urged Kay to make himself comfortable. As he hesitated, he went over to the bed himself and pressed Kay deep down into the bedclothes and pillows. Then he went back to his seat, and at last he asked his first objective question, which made Kay forget everything else. "You're innocent, are you?" he asked. "Yes," said Kay. He felt a simple joy at answering this question, especially as the answer was given to a private individual and therefore would have no consequences. Up till then no one had asked him this question so openly. To make the most of his pleasure, he added, "I am totally innocent." So said the painter, and he lowered his head and seemed to be thinking. Suddenly he raised his head again and said, "Well, if you're innocent, it's all very simple." Kay began to scowl. This supposed trustee of the court was talking like an ignorant child. "My being innocent does not make things simple," said Kay. Despite everything, he couldn't help smiling, and slowly shook his head. "There are many fine details in which the court gets lost, but in the end it reaches into some place where originally there was nothing, and pulls enormous guilt out of it." Yeah, sure," said the painter, as if Kay had been disturbing his train of thought for no reason. "But you are innocent, aren't you?" "Well, of course I am," said Kay. "That's the main thing," said the painter. There was no counter-argument that could influence him, but although he had made up his mind, it was not clear whether he was talking this way because of conviction or indifference. Kay then wanted
Kay,
to find out, and said therefore, "I'm sure you're more familiar with the court than I am. I know hardly more about it than what I've heard, and that's been from many very different people." But they were all agreed on one thing, and that was
they
that
were all
when
agreed
ill
on.
thought out accusations are made, they are not ignored, and that once the court has made an accusation, it is convinced of the guilt of the defendant, and it's very hard to make it think otherwise. "Very hard?" the painter asked, throwing one hand in the air. "It's impossible to make it think otherwise. If I painted all the judges next to each other here on canvas, and you were trying to defend yourself in front of it, you'd have more success with them than you'd ever have with the real court." "Yes," said Kay to himself, forgetting that he had only gone there to investigate the painter. One of the girls behind the door started up again and asked, "Titterelli, is he going to go soon?" "Quiet!" shouted the painter at the door. "Can't you see I'm talking with the gentleman?" But this was not enough to satisfy the girl, and she asked, "You going to paint his picture?" And when the painter didn't answer, she added, "Please don't paint him. He's an 'orrible bloke." There followed an incomprehensible interwoven babble of shouts and replies and calls of agreement. The painter leapt over to the door, opened it very slightly. The girl's clasped hand could be seen stretching through the crack as if they wanted something, and said, "If you are not quiet, I'll throw you all down the stairs. Sit down here on the steps and be quiet." They probably did not obey him immediately, so that he had to command, "Down on the steps." Only then it became quiet. "Oh,
"Oh,
I'm
I'm
sorry
sorry
about
about
that,"
that,"
said the
said the
painter
painter
as he
as he
returned to
returned to
Kay.
Kay.
Kay
Kay
had
had
hardly
hardly
turned
turned
towards the
towards the
door.
door.
He
He
had
had
left
left
it
it
completely
completely
up to
up
the
to the
painter
painter
whether
whether
and
and
how
how
he would
would
place him
place him
under
under
his
his
protection
protection
if he
if he
wanted
wanted
to.
to.
Even now he made hardly any movement as the painter bent over him and, whispering into his ear in order not to be heard outside, said, "These girls belong to the court as well." "How's that?" asked Kay, as he leant his head to one side
As
and
he
looked at the painter. But the painter sat back down on his chair and, half in jest, half in explanation, "Well, everything belongs to the court." "That is something I had never noticed until now," said Kay curtly. This general comment on the painters made his comment about the girls far less disturbing. None the less, Kay looked for a while at the door, behind which the girls were now sitting quietly on the steps, except that one of them had pushed a drinking straw through a crack between the planks and was moving it slowly up and down. "You still don't seem to have much general idea of what the court's about," said the painter, who had stretched his legs wide apart and was tapping loudly on the floor with the tip of his foot. "But as you're innocent, you won't need it anyway. I'll
"I'll
get
get
you
you
out
out
of
of
this
this
by
by myself."
myself." "How do you intend to do that?" asked Kay. "You did say yourself not long ago that it's quite impossible to go to the court with reasons and proofs." "Only impossible for reasons and proofs you take to the court yourself," said the painter, raising his forefinger as if Kay had failed to notice a fine distinction. "It
"It
goes
goes
differently
differently
if
if
you
you
try
try
to
to
do
do
something
something
behind
behind
the
the
public
public
court.
court.
That's to
Let's
say,
say,
in
in
the
the
consultation rooms,
consultation rooms,
in the
in the
corridors,
corridors,
or
or
here,
here,
for
for
instance,
instance,
in
in
my
my
studio."
studio.
Kay
Kay
now
now
began
began
to
to
find
find
it
it
far
far
easier
easier
to
to
believe
believe
what the
what the
painter
painter
was
was
saying,
saying,
or
or
rather it
rather,
was
it was
largely in
largely in
agreement
agreement
with
with
what
what
he had
he had
also
also
been
been
told
told
by
by
others.
others.
In
In
fact,
fact,
it
it
was
was
even
even
quite
quite
promising.
promising.
If it really was so easy to influence the judges through personal contacts, as the lawyer had said, then the painter's contacts with these vain judges was especially important, and at the very least should not be undervalued. And the painter would fit in very well in the circle of assistants that Kay was slowly gathering around him. He had been noted at the bank for his talent in organizing. Here, where he was placed entirely on his own resources, would be a good opportunity to test that talent to its limits. The painter observed the effect his explanation had had on Kay, and then, with a certain unease, said, "Does it not occur to you that the way I'm speaking is almost like a lawyer?" "It's that incessant
That
contact with the gentlemen of the court that has had that influence on me. I gain a lot by it, of course, but I lose a lot, artistically speaking. How did you first come into contact with the judges, then? Asked Kay. He wanted first to gain the painter's trust before he took him into his service. That was very easy, said the painter. I inherited these contracts. My father was court painter before me. It's a position that's always inherited. They can't use new people for it. The rules governing how the various grades of officials are painted are so many and varied, and above all, so secret that no one outside of certain families even knows them. In the drawer there, for instance, I've got my father's notes, which I don't show to anyone, but you're only able to paint judges if you know what they say. Although, even if I lost them, no one could ever dispute my position because of all the rules I just carry round in my head. All the judges want to be painted like the old great judges were, and I'm the only one who can do that. You are to be envied, said Kay, thinking of his position at the bank. Your position is quite unassailable, then. Yes, quite unassailable, said the painter, and he raised his shoulders in pride. That's how I can even afford to help some poor man facing trial now and then. And how do you do that? Asked Kay, as if the painter had not just described him as a poor man. The painter did not let himself be distracted, but said, in your case, for instance, as you're totally innocent, this is what I'll do. The repeated mention of Kay's innocence was becoming irksome to him. It sometimes seemed to him as if the painter was using these comments to make a favorable outcome to the trial a precondition for his help, which of course would make the help itself unnecessary. But despite these doubts, Kay forced himself not to interrupt the painter. He did not want without the painter's help. That was what he had decided, and this help did not seem in any way less questionable than that of the lawyer. Kay valued the painter's help far more highly because it was offered in a way that was more harmless and open. The painter had pulled his seat closer to the bed and continued in a subdued voice, I forgot to ask you, what sort of acquittal is it you want? There are three possibilities: absolute acquittal, apparent acquittal, and deferment. Absolute acquittal is the best, of course, only there's nothing I can do to get that sort of outcome. I don't think there's anyone at all who could do anything to get an absolute acquittal. Probably the only thing that could, that is if the accused is innocent. As you are innocent, it could actually be possible, and you could depend on your innocence alone. In that case, you won't need me or any kind of help. At first, Kay was astonished at this orderly explanation. But then, just as quietly as the painter, he said, I think you're contradicting yourself. How's that? Asked the painter patiently, leaning back with a smile. This seemed smile made Kay feel as if he were examining not the words of the painter, but seeking out inconsistencies in the procedures of the court itself. Nonetheless, he continued unabashed and said, you remarked earlier that the court cannot be approached with reasoned proofs. You later restricted this to the open court, and now you go so far as to say that an innocent man needs no assistance in court. That entails a contradiction. Moreover, you said earlier that the judges can be influenced personally, but now you insist that an absolute acquittal as you call it, can never be attained through personal influence. That entails a second contradiction. It's quite easy to clear up these contradictions," said the painter. "We're talking about two different things. Here, there's what it says in the law, and there's what I know from my own experience. You shouldn't get the two confused. I've never seen it in writing, but the law does, of course, say on the one hand that the innocent will be set free, but on the other hand, it doesn't say that the judges can be influenced. But in my experience, it's the other way around. I don't know of any absolute acquittals, but I do know of many times when a judge has been influenced. It's possible, of course, that there was no innocence in any of the cases I know about. But is that likely? Not a single innocent defendant in so many cases. When I was a boy, I used to listen closely to my father when he told us about court cases at home. And the judges that came to his studio talked about the court. In our circles, nobody talks about anything else. I hardly ever got the chance to go to the court myself, but always made use of it when I could. I've listened to countless trials at important stages in their development. I've followed them closely as far as they could be followed, and I have to say that I've never seen a single acquittal. So, not a single acquittal, said Kay, as if talking to himself and his hopes. That confirms the impression I already have of the courts. So there's no point in it from the side either. They could replace the whole court with a single hangman. You shouldn't generalize, said the painter, dissatisfied. I've only been talking about my own experience. Well, that's enough, said Kay. Or have you heard of any acquittals that happened earlier? They say there have been some acquittals earlier, the painter answered, but it's very hard to be sure about it. The courts don't make their final conclusions public. Not even the judges are allowed to know about them. So that all we know about these earlier cases are just legends. But most of them did involve absolute acquittals. You can believe that, but they can't be proved. On the other hand, you shouldn't forget about them either. I'm sure there is some truth to them, and they are very beautiful. I've painted a few pictures myself depicting these legends. My assessment will not be altered by mere legends, said Kay. I don't suppose it's possible to cite these legends in court, is it? The painter laughed. No, you can't cite them in court, he said. Then there's no point in talking about them, said Kay. He wanted for the time being to accept anything the painter told him, even if he thought it unlikely or contradicted what he had been told by others. He did not now have the time to examine the truth of everything the painter said, or even to disprove it. He would have achieved as much as he could if the painter would help him in any way, even if this help would not be decisive. As a result, he said, so let's pay no more attention to absolute acquittal. But you mentioned two other possibilities, apparent acquittal and deferment. They're the only possibilities, said the painter, but before we talk about them, would you not like to take your coat off? You must be hot. Yes, said Kay, who until then had paid attention to nothing but the painter's explanations. But now that he had had the heat pointed out to him, his brow began to sweat heavily. It's almost unbearable. The painter nodded, as if he understood Kay's discomfort very well. "Could we not open the window?" asked Kay. "No," said the painter, "it's only a fixed pane of glass. It can't be opened." Kay now realized that all this time he had been hoping the painter would suddenly go over to the window and pull it open. He had prepared himself even for the fog that he would breathe in through his open mouth. The thought that here he was entirely cut off from the air made him feel dizzy. He tapped lightly on the bedspread beside him, and with a weak voice said, "This is very inconvenient and unhealthy." "Oh no," said the painter in defense of his window. "As it can't be opened, this room retains the heat better than if the window were double glazed. Even though it's only a single pane, there's not much need to air the room, as there's so much ventilation through the gaps in the wood. But when I do want to, I can open one of my doors, or even both of them." Kay was slightly consoled by this explanation and looked around to see where the second door was. The painter saw him do so and said, "It's behind you. I had to hide it behind the bed." Only then was Kay able to see the little door in the wall. "It's really much too small for a studio here," said the painter, as if he wanted to anticipate any objection Kay would make. "I had to arrange things as well as I could. That's obviously a very bad place for the bed in front of the door. For instance, when the judge I'm painting at present comes, he always comes through the door by the bed, and I've even given him a key to this door so that he can wait for me here in the studio when I'm not home, although nowadays he usually comes early in the morning when I'm still asleep. And of course it always wakes me up when I hear the door open beside the bed, however fast asleep I am. If you could hear the way I curse him as he climbs over my bed in the morning, you'd lose all respect for judges. I suppose I could take the key away from him, but that'd only make things worse. It only takes a tiny effort to break any of the doors here off their hinges." All the time the painter was speaking, Kay was considering whether he should take off his coat, but he finally realized if he didn't do so, he would quite unable to stay here any longer, so he took off his frock coat and lay it on his knee, so that he could put it back on again as soon as the conversation was over. He had hardly done this when one of the girls called out, "Now he's taken off his coat," and they could all be heard pressing around the gaps in the planks to see the spectacle for themselves. "The girls think I'm going to paint your portrait," said the painter, "and that's why you're taking your coat off." "I see," said Kay, only slightly amused by this, as he felt little better than he had before, even though he now sat in his shirt sleeves. With some irritation he asked, "What did you say the two other possibilities were?" He had already forgotten the terms used. "Apparent acquittal and deferment," said the painter. "It's up to you which one you choose. You can get either of them if I help you, but it'll take some effort, of course. The difference between them is that an apparent acquittal needs concentrated effort for a while, and that deferment takes much less effort, but it has to be sustained. Now then, apparent acquittal, if that's what you want, I'll write down an assertion of your innocence on a piece of paper. The text for an assertion of this sort was passed down to me from my father, and it's quite unassailable. I take this assertion round to the judges I know, so I'll start off with the one I'm currently painting, and put the assertion to him. When he comes for his sitting this evening, I'll lay the assertion in front of him, explain that you're innocent, and give him my personal guarantee of it, and that's not just a superficial guarantee, it's a real one, and it's binding." The painter's eyes seemed to show some reproach of Kay for wanting to impose that sort of responsibility on him. "That would be very kind of you," said Kay. "And would the judge then believe you and nonetheless pass an absolute acquittal? It's like I just said, answered the painter. And anyway, it's not entirely sure that all the judges would believe me. Many of them, for instance, might want me to bring you to see them personally. So then you'd have to come along too. But at least then, if that happens, the matter is halfway won, especially as I teach you in advance exactly how you need to act with the judge concerned, of course. What also happens, though, is that there are some judges who turn me down in advance. And that's worse. I'll certainly make several attempts, but still, we'll have to forget about them. But at least we can afford to do that, as no one judge can pass the decisive verdict. Then when I've got enough judges' signatures on this document, I take it to the judge who's concerned with your case. I might even have his signature already, in which case things develop a bit quicker than they would do otherwise, but there aren't usually many hold-ups from then on, and that's the time that the defendant can feel most confident. It's odd but true that people feel more confident in this time than they do after they've been acquitted. There's no particular exertion needed now. When he has the document asserting the defendant's innocence, guaranteed by a number of other judges, the judge can acquit you without any worries, and although there are still several formalities to be gone through, there's no doubt that's what he'll do as a favor to me and several other acquaintances. You, however, walk out of the court and you're free. So then I'll be free, said Kay, hesitantly. That's right, said the painter, but only apparently free, or, to put it in a better way, temporarily free, as the most junior judges, the ones I know, they don't have the right to give the final acquittal. Only the highest judge can do that. In the court, that's quite of reach for you, for me, and for all of us. We don't know how things look there, and incidentally, we don't want to know. The right to acquit people is a major privilege, and our judges don't have it, but they do have the right to free people from the indictment. That's to say, if they're freed in this way, then for the time being the charge is withdrawn, but it's still hanging over their heads, and it only takes an order from a higher up to bring it back into force. And as I'm in such good contract with the court, I can also tell you how the difference between absolute and apparent acquittal is described, just in a superficial way, in the directives to the court offices. If there's an absolute acquittal, all proceedings should stop. Everything disappears from the process, not just the indictment, but the trial, and even the acquittal disappears. Everything just disappears. With an apparent acquittal, it's different. When that happens, nothing has changed except that the case for your innocence, for your acquittal, and the grounds for the acquittal have been made stronger. Apart from that, proceedings go on as before. The court offices continue their business and the case gets passed to higher courts, gets passed back down to the lower courts, and so on, backwards and forwards, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, to and fro. It's impossible to know exactly what's happening while this is going on. Seen from outside, it can sometimes seem that everything has been long since forgotten. The documents have been lost, and the acquittal is complete. No one familiar with the court would believe it. No documents ever get lost. The court forgets nothing. One day, no one expects it, some judge or other picks up the document and looks more closely at them. He notices that this particular case is still active, and orders the defendant's immediate arrest. I've been talking here as if there's a long delay between apparent acquittal and rearrest. That is quite possible. I do know of a case like that, but it's just as likely that the defendant goes home after he's been acquitted and finds somebody there waiting to rearrest him. Then, of course, his life as a free man is at an end. And does the trial start over again? Asked Kay, finding it hard to believe. The trial will always start over again, said the painter, but there is, once again as before, the possibility of getting an apparent acquittal. Once again, the accused has to muster all his strength and mustn't give up. The painter said that last phrase possibly as a result of the impression that Kay, whose shoulders had dropped somewhat, gave on him. But to get a second acquittal, asked Kay, as if in anticipation of further revelations by the painter, is that not harder to get than the first time? As far as that's concerned, answered the painter, there's nothing you can say for certain. You mean, do you, that this second arrest would have an adverse influence on the judge, and the verdict he passes on the defendant? That's not how it happens. When the acquittal is passed, the judges are already aware that the arrest is likely, so when it happens, it has hardly an effect. But there are countless other reasons why the judge's mood and their legal acumen in the case can be altered, and efforts to obtain the second acquittal must therefore be suited to the new conditions and generally just as vigorous as the first. But this second acquittal will once again not be final, said Kay, shaking his head. Of course not, said the painter. The second acquittal is followed by the third arrest, the third acquittal by the fourth arrest, and so on. That what is meant by the term apparent acquittal. Kay was silent. You clearly don't think an apparent acquittal offers much advantage, said the painter. Perhaps deferment would suit you better. Would you like me to explain what deferment is about? Kay nodded. The painter had leaned back and spread himself in his chair. His nightshirt was open. He had pushed his hand inside and was stroking his breast and his sides. Deferment, said the painter, looking vaguely in front of him for a while, as if trying to find a perfect, appropriate explanation. Deferment consists of keeping proceedings permanently in their earliest stages. To do that, the accused and those helping him need to keep in continuous personal contact with the court, especially those helping him. I repeat, this doesn't require so much effort as getting an apparent acquittal, but it probably requires a lot more attention. You must never let the trial out of your sight. You have to go and see the appropriate judge at regular intervals, as well as when something in particular comes up, and whatever you do, you have to try and remain friendly with him. If you don't know the judge personally, you have to influence him through the judges you do know, and you have to do it without giving up on the direct discussion. As long as you don't fail to do any of these things, you can be reasonably sure the trial won't get past its first stages. The trial doesn't stop, but the defendant is almost as certain of avoiding conviction as if he'd been acquitted. Compared with an apparent acquittal, deferment has the advantage that the defendant's future is less uncertain. He's safe from the shock of being suddenly rearrested, and doesn't need to fear the exertion and stress involved in getting an apparent acquittal just when everything else in his life would make it most difficult. Deferment does have certain disadvantages of its own, though, and they shouldn't be underestimated. I don't mean by this that the defendant is never free. He's never free in the proper sense of the word with an apparent acquittal either. There's another disadvantage, proceedings can't be prevented from moving forward unless there are some, at least ostensible, reasons given. So something needs to seem to be happening when looked out from the outside. This means that from time to time, various injunctions have to be obeyed, the accused has to be questioned, investigations have to take place, and so on. The trial's been artificially constrained inside a tiny circle, and it has to be continuously spun round within it. And that, of
Spun
course,
round within
brings
it.
with it certain unpleasantness for the accused, although you shouldn't imagine they're all that bad.
Although
All of this is just for show.
shouldn't
The
imagine they're all
interrogations, for
that.
instance, they're only very
All of this
short. If you ever don't have the time or don't feel
ever
like going to them, you can offer an excuse. With some judges, you can even arrange the injunctions together a
a
long
long
time in
time in
advance.
advance.
In
In
essence,
essence,
all
all
it
it means
means is that
that
as
as
the
the
accused, you have to report to the judge from time to time. Even while Painter was speaking those last words, Kay had laid his coat over his arm and had stood up. Immediately from outside the door there was a cry of, "He's standing up now!" "Are you leaving already?" asked the painter, who had also stood up. "It must be the air that's driving you out. I'm very sorry about that. There's still a lot I need to tell you. I had to put everything very briefly, but I hope at least it was all clear." "Oh, yes," said Kay, whose head was aching from the effort of listening. Despite this affirmation, the painter summed it all up once more, as if he wanted to give Kate something to console him on his way home. "Both have in common that they prevent the defendant being convicted," he said, "but they also prevent his probably acquitted," said Kate quietly, as if ashamed to acknowledge it. "You've got it in essence," said the painter quickly. Kay placed his hand on his winter overcoat, but could not bring himself to put it on. Most of all, he would have liked to pack everything together and run out to the fresh air. Not even the girls could induce him to put his coat on, even though they were already loudly telling each other that he was doing so. The painter still had to interpret Kate's mood in some way, so he said, "I expect you've deliberately avoided deciding between my suggestions, yet that's good. I would even have advised against making a decision right away. There's no more than a hair's breadth of difference between the advantages and disadvantages. Everything has to be carefully weighed up. But the most important thing is you shouldn't lose too much time." "I'll come back here again soon," said Kay, who had suddenly decided to put his frock coat on, threw his overcoat over his shoulder, and hurried over to the door, behind which the girls now began to scream. Kay thought he could even see the screaming girls through the door. "Well, you'll have to keep your word," said the painter, who had not followed him. "Otherwise I'll to the bank to ask about it myself. Will you open this door for me?" said Kay, pulling at the handle, which, as he noticed from the resistance, was being held tightly by the girls on the other side. "Do you want to be bothered by the girls?" asked the painter. "It's better if you use the other way out," he said, pointing to the door behind the bed. Kay agreed to this and jumped back to the bed. But instead of opening the door, the painter crawled under the bed and from underneath asked Kay, "Just a moment more. Would you not like to see a picture I could sell to you?" Kay did not want to be impolite. The painter really had taken his side and promised to help him more in the future, and because of Kay's forgetfulness there had been no mention of any payment for the painter's help, so Kay not Kay did not want to be impolite. The painter really had taken his side and promised to help him more in the future, and because of Kay's forgetfulness there had been no mention of any payment for the painter's help, so Kay could not turn him down now and allowed him to show him the picture, even though he was quivering with impatience to get out of the studio. From under the bed the painter withdrew a pile of unframed paintings. They were so covered in dust that when the painter tried to blow it off, the one on top the dust swirled around in front of Kay's eyes, robbing him of breath for some time. "Moorland landscape," said the painter, passing the picture to Kay. It showed two sickly trees, well separated from each other in dark grass. In the background there was a multicolored sunset. "That's nice," said Kay. "I'll buy it." Kay expressed himself in this curt way, without any thought, so he was glad when the painter did not take this amiss, and picked up a second painting from the floor. "This is a counterpart to the first picture," said the painter. "Perhaps it has been intended as a counterpart, but there was not the slightest difference to be seen between it and the first picture. There were the trees, there were the grass, and there was a sunset, but this was of little importance to Kay. They are beautiful landscapes," he said. "I'll buy them both and hang them in my office." "You seem to like this subject," said the painter, picking up a third painting. "Good job. I've still got another similar picture here." The picture, though, was not similar. Rather, it was exactly the same moorland landscape. The painter was fully exploiting this opportunity to sell off his old pictures. "I'll take this one too," said Kay. "How much do the 3 paintings cost?" "We can talk about that next time," said the painter. "You're in a hurry now, and we'll still be in contact, and besides, I'm glad you like the paintings. I'll give you all the paintings I've got down here. They're all moorland landscapes. I've painted a lot of moorland landscapes. A lot of people don't like that sort of picture because they're too gloomy, but there are others, and you're one of them, who love gloomy themes." But Kay was not in the mood to hear about the professional experiences of this painter Cumbegger. "Wrapped them all up," he called out, interrupting the painter as he was speaking. "My servant will come to fetch them in the morning." "There's no need for that," said the painter. "I expect I can find a porter for you who can go with you now." And at last he leant over the bed and unlocked the door. "Just step on the bed. Don't worry about that," said the painter. "That's what everyone else does who comes in here." Even without this invitation, Kay had shown no compunction in already placing his foot in the middle of the bed covers. Then he looked out through the open door and drew his foot back in again. "What is that?" he asked the painter. "What are you so surprised at?" he asked, surprised in his turn. "Those are court offices. Didn't you know there are court offices here?" "There are court offices in almost every attic. Why should this building be any different?" "Even my studio is actually one of the court offices, but the court put it at my disposal." It was not so much finding court offices even here that shocked Kay. He was mainly shocked at himself, at his own naivety in court matters. It seemed to him that one of the most basic rules governing how a defendant should behave was always to be prepared. Never allow surprises, never to look unsuspecting to the right when the judge stood beside him to his left. And this was the very basic rule that he was continually violating. A long corridor extended in front of him. Air blew in from which, compared with the air in the studio, was refreshing. There were benches set along each side of the corridor, just as in the waiting area for the office he went to himself. There seemed to be precise rules governing how offices should be equipped. There did not seem to be many people visiting the offices that day. There was a man here, half sitting, half lying. His face was buried in his arms on the bench, and he seemed to be sleeping. Another man was standing in the half darkness at the end of the corridor. Kay now climbed over the bed. The painter followed him with the pictures. They soon came across a servant of the court. Kay was now able to recognize all the servants of the court from the gold buttons they wore on their civilian clothes below the normal buttons, and the painter instructed him to go with Kay, carrying the pictures. Kay staggered more than he walked, his handkerchief pressed over his mouth. They had nearly reached the exit when the girls stormed in on them, so Kay had not been able to avoid them. They had clearly seen that the second door of the studio had been opened, and had gone around to impose themselves on him from this side. "I can't come with you any further," called out the painter with a laugh as the girls pressed in. "Good-bye, and don't hesitate too long." Kay did not even look round at him. Once on the street, he took the first cab he came across. He now had to get rid of the servant, whose gold button continually caught his eye, even if it caught no one else's. As a servant, the servant of the court was going to sit on the coach box, but Kay chased him down from there. It was already well into the afternoon when Kay arrived in front of the bank. He would have liked to leave the pictures in the cab, but feared there might be some occasion when he would have to let the painter see he still had them. So he had the pictures taken to his office and locked them in the lowest drawer of his desk, so that he could at least keep them safe from the deputy director's view for the next few days. Chapter 8. Block, the businessman, dismissing the lawyer.
8.
Kay had at last made the decision to withdraw his defense from the lawyer. It was impossible to remove his doubts as to whether this was the right decision, but this was outweighed by his belief in its necessity. The decision on the day he intended to go to see the lawyer took a lot of the strength he needed for his work. He worked exceptionally slowly. He had to remain in his office a long time, and it was already past 10 o'clock when he finally stood in front of the lawyer's front door. Even before he rang, he considered whether it might not be better to give the lawyer notice by letter or telephone. A personal conversation would certainly be very difficult. Nonetheless, Kate did not actually want to do without it. If he gave notice by any other means, it would be received in silence or with a few formulated words, and unless Lenny could discover anything, Kay would never learn how the lawyer had taken his dismissal, and what its consequences might be in the lawyer's not unimportant opinion. But sitting in front of him and taken by surprise by his dismissal, Kay would be able easily to infer everything he wanted from the lawyer's face and behavior. Even if he could not be induced to say very much, it was not even of the question that Kay might, after all, be persuaded that it would be best to leave his defense to the lawyer and withdraw his dismissal. As usual, there was at first no response to Kay's ring at the door. Lenny could be a bit quicker, thought Kay, but he could at least be glad there was nobody else interfering, as usually happened, be it the man in his nightshirt or anyone else who might bother him. As Kay pressed on the button for the second time, he looked back at the other door, but this time it too remained closed. At last two eyes appeared at the spy hatch in the lawyer's door. Although they weren't Lenny's eyes. Someone unlocked the door, but kept himself pressed against it as he called back inside, "It's him!" And only then did he open the door properly. Kay pushed against the door, as behind him he could already hear the key being hurriedly turned in the lock of the door to the other flat. When the door in front of him finally opened, he stormed straight into the hallway. Through the corridor which led between the rooms, he saw Lenny, to whom the warning cry of the door opener had been directed, still running away in her nightshirt. He looked at her for a moment and then looked around at the person who had opened the door. It was a small, wizened man with a full beard. He held a candle in his hands. "Do you work here?" asked Kay. "No," answered the man. "I don't belong here at all. The lawyer is only representing me. I'm here on legal business." "Without your coat?" asked Kay, indicating the man's deficiency of dress with a gesture of his hands. "Oh, do forgive me," said the man, and he looked at himself in the light of the candle he was holding, as if he had not known about his appearance until then. "Is Lenny your lover?" asked Kay curtly. He had set his legs slightly apart. His hands, in which he held his hat, were behind his back. Merely by being in possession of a thick overcoat he felt his advantage over this thin little man. "Oh, God!" he said, and shocked, raised one hand in front of his face as if in defense. "No, no, no. What can you be thinking?" "You look honest enough," said Kay with a smile, "but come along anyway." Kay indicated with his hat which way the man was to go and let him go ahead of him. "What is you name then?" asked Kay on the way. "Block. I'm a business man," said the small man, twisting himself round as he thus introduced himself, although Kay did not allow him to stop moving. "Is that your real name?" asked Kay. "Of course it is," was the man's reply. "Why do you doubt it?" "I thought you might have some reason to keep your name secret," said Kay. He felt himself as much at liberty as is normally only felt in foreign parts when speaking with people of lower standing, keeping everything about himself to himself, speaking only casually about the interest of the other, able to raise him to a level above one's own, but also able at will to let him drop again. Kay stopped at the door of the lawyer's office, opened it, and to the business man, who had obediently gone ahead, called, "Not so fast, bring some light here." Kay thought Lenny might have hidden in here. He let the businessman search in every corner, but the room was empty. In front of the picture of the judge, Kay took hold of the businessman's braces to stop him moving. "Do you know him?" he asked, pointing upwards with his finger. The businessman lifted the candle, blinked as he looked up, and said, "It's a judge." "An important judge?" asked Kay, and stood to the side and in front of the businessman so that he could observe what impression the picture had on him. The businessman, looking up in admiration, "He's an important judge." "You don't have much insight," said Kay. "He is the lowest of the lowest examining judges." "I remember now," said the businessman, as he lowered the candle. "That's what I've already been told." "Well, of course you have," called out Kay. "I'd forgotten about it. Of course you would already have been told." "But why?" asked the businessman as he moved forward towards the door, propelled by the hands of Kay. Outside in the corridor, Kay said, "You know where Lenny's hidden, do you?" "Hidden?" said the businessman. "No, but she might be in the kitchen, cooking soup for the lawyer." "Why didn't you say that immediately?" asked Kay. "I was going to take you there, but you called me back again." answered the businessman, as if confused by the contradictory commands. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" said Kay. "Now take me there." Kay had never been in the kitchen. It was surprisingly big and very well equipped. The stove alone was 3 times bigger than normal stoves, but it was not possible to see any detail behind this, as the kitchen was at the time illuminated by no more than a small lamp hanging by the entrance. At the stove stood Lenny in a white apron, as always, breaking eggs into a pot, standing on a spirit lamp. "Good evening,
Good evening,
Joseph," she
Joseph,
said with a glance
said with a glance
sideways.
sideways.
"Good evening,"
Good
said
evening,
Kay,
said Kay,
pointing with one
pointing
hand
with
to a
one hand
chair
to a chair
in a corner
in a
which
corner
the
which the
businessman was to sit
businessman
on,
was to sit
and
on,
he did
and
indeed
he
sit
did
down on
indeed
it.
sit down on it.
Kay, however,
Kay,
went very
however, went very
close
close
behind Lenny's back,
Lenny's back,
leaned over her shoulder,
over
and
her
asked,
shoulder, and asked,
"Who is this
"Who is
man?"
this?"
Lenny put one
Lenny
hand
put
around
one hand
Kay.
around
As
Kay
she stirred
as
the
she
soup
stirred the
with the
soup
other,
with the
she
other,
drew him in
drew him in
forward towards
forward
herself
towards
and said,
herself,
"He's a
and
pitiful
a
character.
pitiful character,
A poor
a poor
businessman by the name
businessman
of
by the
Block.
name of Block.
Just look at him."
Just look at him.
The two of them
The
looked
two of
back
them
over their
looked back over their
shoulders. The
shoulders.
businessman
The
was sitting on the
businessman was
chair
sitting on
that
the chair
Kay
that
had
Kay
directed him
had
to.
directed him to.
He had
He
extinguished
had
the candle,
extinguished the
whose
candle,
light was no
whose
longer
light was no
needed,
longer
and
needed,
pressed on the wick with
on
his
the wick
finger
with
to
his
stop the
finger to
smoke.
stop the smoke.
"You were
"You
in your
were in
nightshirt,"
your
said
nightshirt,"
Kay,
said
putting
Kay,
his hand
putting his
on her
hand
head
on her
and
head
turning it
and
back
turning
towards
it
the
back towards
stove.
the stove.
She was silent.
Silent.
"Is he your lover?" asked Kay. She was about to take hold of the pot of soup, but Kay took both her hands and said, "Answer me." She said, "Come into the office. I'll explain everything to you." "No," said Kay. "I want you to explain it here." She put her arms around him and wanted to kiss him. Kay, though, pushed her away and said, "I don't want you to kiss me now." "Joseph," said Lenny, looking at Kay imploringly but frankly in the eyes, "you're not going to be jealous of Mr. Block now, are you?" "Rudy,"
"Rudy,"
she then said, turning to the businessman, "help me out, will you? I'm being suspected of something. You can see that. Leave the candle alone." It had looked as though Mr. Block had not been paying attention, but he had been following closely. "I don't even know why you might be jealous," he said ingenuously. "Nor do I, actually," said Kay, looking at the businessman with a smile. Lenny laughed out loud, and, while Kay was not paying attention, took the opportunity of embracing him and whispering, leave him alone. Now, you can see what sort of person he is. I've been helping him a little bit, because he's an important client of the lawyer's. No other reason. And what about you? Do you want to speak to the lawyer at this time of day? He's very unwell today, but if you want, I'll tell him you're here. But
"But
you
you
can
can
certainly spend the night with me. It's so long since you were last here. Even the lawyer has been asking about you. Don't neglect your case. And I've got some things to tell you that I've learned about. But now, before anything else, take your coat off." She helped him off with his coat, took the hat off his head, ran with the things into the hallway to hang them up. Then she ran back and saw to the soup. "Do you want me to tell him you're here straight away, or take him his soup first?" "Tell him I'm here first," said Kay. He was in a bad mood. He had originally intended a detailed discussion of his business with Lenny, especially the question of his giving the lawyer notice, but now he no longer wanted to because of the presence of the businessman. Now he considered his affair too important to let this little businessman take part in it and perhaps change some of his decisions. And so he called Lenny back, even though she was already on her way to the lawyer. "Bring him his soup first," he said. "I want him to get his strength up for the discussion with me. He'll need it." "You're a
"You're a
client
client
of
of
the
the
lawyer's
lawyer's
too,
too,
aren't
aren't
you?"
you?"
said the
said the businessman
businessman quietly
quietly
from
from
his
his
corner,
corner,
as
as
if
if
he
he
were
were
trying
trying
to
to
find
find
this
this
out.
out.
It
It
was
was
not,
not,
however,
however,
taken
taken
well.
well.
"What
"What
business
business
is
is
that
that
of
of
yours?"
yours?"
said
said
Kay,
Kay.
and Lenny
And he
said,
said,
"Will you be
"Will you be
quiet?
quiet?
I'll
I'll
take
take
him
his
his soup
soup
first
first
then,
then,
shall
shall
I?"
I?"
and she poured the soup into a dish. The only worry then is that he might go to sleep soon after he's eaten. What I've got to say to him will keep him awake, said Kay, who still wanted to intimate that he intended some important negotiations with the lawyer. He wanted Lenny to ask him what it was and only then to ask her advice. But instead, she just promptly carried out the order he had given her. When she went over to him with the dish, she deliberately brushed against him and whispered, "I'll tell him you're here as soon as he's eaten the soup so that I can get you back as soon as possible." "Just go," Kay said. "Just go. Be a bit more friendly," she said, and still holding the dish, turned completely round once more in the doorway. Kay watched her as she went. The decision had finally been made that the lawyer was to be dismissed. It was probably better that he had not been able to discuss the matter any more with Lenny beforehand. She hardly understood the complexity of the matter. She would certainly have advised him against it, and perhaps would even have prevented him from dismissing the lawyer this time. He would have remained in doubt and unease, and eventually have carried out his decision after a while anyway, as this decision was something he could not avoid. The sooner it was carried out, the more harm would be avoided. And, moreover, perhaps the businessman had something to say on the matter. Kate turned round. The businessman hardly noticed it was he was about to stand up. "Stay where you are," said Kay, and pulled up a chair beside him. "Have you been a client of the lawyer's for a long time?" asked Kay. "Yes," said the businessman, "a very long time." "How many years has he been representing you so far, then?" asked Kay. "I don't know how you mean," said the businessman. "He's been my business lawyer. I buy and sell cereals. He's been my business lawyer since I took the business over, and that's about 20 years now. But perhaps you mean my own trial, and he's been representing me in that since it started, and that's been more than 5 years. Yes, well over 5 years," he then added, pulling out an old briefcase. "I've got everything written down. I can tell you the exact dates if you like. It's so hard to remember everything. Probably my trial's been going on much longer than that. It started soon after the death of my wife, and that's been more than 5.5 years now." Kay moved in closer to him. "So the lawyer takes an ordinary legal business, does he asked. This combination of criminal and commercial business seemed surprisingly reassuring for Kay. "Oh, yes," said the businessman, and then he whispered, "They even say he's more efficient in jurisprudence than he is in other matters." But then he seemed to regret saying this, and he laid a hand on Kay's shoulder and said, "Please don't betray me to him, will you?" Kay patted this thigh to reassure him, and said, "No, I don't betray people. He can be so vindictive, you see," said the businessman. "I'm sure he won't do anything against such a faithful client as you," said Kay. "Oh, he might do," said the businessman. "When he gets cross it doesn't matter who it is, and anyway, I'm not really faithful to him." "How's that then?" asked Kay. "I'm not sure I should tell you about it," said the businessman hesitantly. "I think it'll be all right," said Kay. "Well then," said the businessman, "I'll tell you about some of it. But you'll have to tell me a secret too. Then we can support each other with the lawyer." "You are very careful," said Kay, "but I'll tell you a secret that will set your mind completely at ease. Now tell me, in what way have you been unfaithful to the lawyer?" "I've," said the businessman hesitantly, in a tone as if he were confessing something dishonorable, "I've taken on another lawyer besides him." "That's not serious," said Kay, a little disappointed. "It is. Here," said the businessman, who had had some difficulty breathing since making his confession, but who now, after hearing Kay's comment, began to feel more trust for him. "That's not allowed, and it's allowed least of all to take on petty lawyers when you've already got a proper one. And that's just what I've done. Besides him, I've got 5 petty lawyers." "5!" exclaimed Kay, astonished at this number. "5 lawyers beside the one?" The
The
businessman
businessman
nodded.
nodded.
"I'm
"I'm
even
even
negotiating with the
the
sixth
sixth
one."
one.
"But
But
why
why
do
do
you
you
need
need
so
so
many
many
lawyers?"
lawyers?"
asked
asked
Kay.
Kay.
"I need all
"All
of
of
them,"
them,"
said the
said the
businessman.
businessman.
"Would
"Would
you
you
mind
mind
explaining
explaining
that
that
to
to
me?"
me?"
asked
asked
Kay.
Kay.
"I'd
"I'd
be
be
glad
glad
to,"
to,"
said the
said the
businessman.
businessman.
"Most
"Most
of
of
all,
all,
I
I
don't
don't
want to
want to
lose
lose
my
my
case."
case."
"Well,
"Well,
that's
that's
obvious.
obvious.
So
So
that
that
means
means
I
I
mustn't
mustn't
neglect
neglect
anything
anything
that
that
might
might
be
be
of
of
use
use,
to me, even if
even
there's
if
very
there's
little
very
hope
little
of a
hope of a
particular
particular
thing
thing
being of any
being of any
use. I
use.
can't just throw
Can't
it
just throw it
away.
away.
So
So
everything I
everything I
have I've
have,
put
I've
to
put
use in my
in my
case.
case.
I've taken
I've taken
all the money
all the
out of
money
my
out of my
business. For
business. For
example,
example,
the
the
offices for my
offices for my
business used to
business
occupy
occupy
nearly a
nearly
whole
a whole
floor, but
floor, but
now
now
all I need
all
is a
I need
little
is a
room
little
at the
room at
back
the
where I
back where
work
I
with one
work with one
apprentice.
apprentice.
It wasn't
It
just
wasn't
using
just
up the
using up the
money
money
that caused
that
the
caused the
difficulty, of
difficulty. Of
course.
course,
It was
it
much
was
more
much
to
more
do with
to
me
do with
not
me
working
not
at the
working at the
business
business
as much
as
as I
much as I
used to.
used to.
If you
If
want to
you
do
want to do
something about your
something about your
trial,
trial,
you don't have
you don't
much
have
time
much
for
time
anything
for anything
else.
else.
So you're
So
also
you're also
working at the
working at
court
the court
yourself?"
yourself.
asked Kay.
Hey,
"That's just what
it's
I
just
want to
what I
learn
want to
more
learn more
about.
about.
I can't
I
tell
can't
you very
tell you
much
very
about
much
that,"
about that.
said the businessman.
Businessman.
"At
At
first,
first,
I tried
I
to do
tried
that
to do
too,
that
but I
too, but
soon
I
had to
soon
give it
had to
up
give it up
again.
again.
It wears you
It
out
wears
too
you out
much,
too much.
and it's really
It's
not
really
much
not much.
use." And it turned out
It
to be
turned out to
quite
be quite
impossible to work
impossible
there
to work there
yourself
yourself
and to
and to
negotiate, at
negotiate,
least for
at
me it
least for me
was.
it was.
It's a
It's a
heavy
heavy
strain
strain
there just
there just
sitting
sitting
and waiting.
and
You
waiting.
know
You know
yourself what
yourself
the
what
air
the
is
air
like in
is
these
like in these
offices.
offices.
"How do you know I've been there, then?" asked
How do you,
Kay. "I was in the waiting room myself when you went through." "What a
what a
coincidence
coincidence
that
that
is!"
is,
exclaimed
exclaimed
Kay,
Kay,
totally
totally
engrossed and
engrossed and
forgetting
forgetting
how
how
ridiculous
ridiculous
the
the
businessman
businessman
had
had
seemed to
seemed to
him
him
earlier.
earlier.
"So
So
you
you
saw
saw
me?
me?
You were
You
in
were
the
in the
waiting
waiting
room
room
when
when
I
I
went
went
through?"
through.
"Yes,
Yes,
I
I
did
did
go
go
through
through
it
it
one
one
time."
time.
"It
It
isn't
isn't
such a
such a
big
big
coincidence,"
coincidence,
said the
said the
businessman.
businessman.
"I'm
I'm
there
there
nearly
nearly
every
every
day."
day.
"I
I
expect
expect
I'll
I'll
have to
have to
go
go
there
there
quite
quite
often
often
myself
myself
now,"
now,
said
said
Kay.
Kay.
"Although
Although
I
I
can
can
hardly
hardly
expect to
expect
be
to be
shown the
shown the
same
same
respect
respect
as
as
I
I
was then." They all stood up for me. They
they
must
must
have
have
thought
thought
I
I
was
was
a
a
judge.
judge.
"No,"
No,
said the
said the
businessman.
businessman.
"We were
We were
greeting the
greeting the
servant
servant
of
of
the
the
court.
court.
We
We
knew
knew
you
you
were
were
a
a
defendant.
defendant.
That
That
sort
sort
of
of
news
news
spreads
spreads
very
very
quickly."
quickly.
"So
So
you
you
already
already
knew
knew
that
that
about
about
me,"
me,
said Kay. "The way I behaved must have seemed very arrogant
said
to
Kay.
you. Did you criticize me for it afterwards?" "No," said the businessman, "quite the opposite. That
That
was
was
just
just
stupidity." "What do you mean, stupidity?" asked Kay. "Why are you asking about it?" said the businessman, in some irritation. "You still don't seem to know the people there, and you might take it wrong. Don't forget, in proceedings like this, there are always lots of different things coming up to talk about. Things that you just can't understand with reason alone. You just get too tired and distracted for most things, and so, instead, people rely on superstition. I'm talking about the others, but I'm no better myself. One of these superstitions, for example, is that you can learn a lot about the outcomes of a defendant's case by looking at his face, especially
especially
the
the
shape
shape
of
of
his
his
lips.
lips.
There are lots who believe
Believe that,
that, and they said they could see from the shape of your lips that you'd definitely be found guilty very soon. I repeat that all this is just a ridiculous superstition, and in most cases it's completely disproved by the facts, but when you live in that society it's hard to hold yourself back from beliefs like that. Just think how much effect that superstition can have. You spoke to one of them there, didn't you? He was hardly able to give you an answer. There are lots of things that can make you confused, of course, but one of them, for him, was the appearance of your lips. He told us all later he thought he could see something in your lips that meant he'd be convicted himself." "On my lips?" asked Kay, pulling out a pocket mirror and examining himself. "I can see nothing special about my lips. Can you?" "Nor can I," said the businessman. "Nothing at all. "These people are so superstitious," exclaimed Kay. "Isn't that what I just told you?" asked the businessman. "Do you then have that much contact with each other, exchanging each other's opinions?" said Kay. "I've kept myself completely apart so far." "They don't normally have much contact with each other," said the businessman. "That would be impossible, there are so many of them. And they don't have much in common either. If a group of them ever thinks they have found something in common, it soon turns out they were mistaken. There's nothing you can do as a group where the court's concerned. Each case is examined separately. The court is very painstaking. So there's nothing to be achieved by forming into a group. Only sometimes an individual will achieve something in secret, and it's only when that's been done the others learn about it. Nobody knows how it was done, so there's no sense of togetherness. You meet people now and then in the waiting rooms, but we don't talk much there. The superstitious belief were established a long time ago, and they spread all by themselves." "I saw those gentlemen in the waiting room," said Kay. "It seems so pointless for them to be waiting in that way." "Waiting is not pointless," said the businessman. "It's only pointless if you try and interfere yourself. I told you just now I've got 5 lawyers beside this one. You might think I thought it myself at first. You might think I could leave the whole thing entirely up to them now. That would be entirely wrong. I can leave it up to them less than when I had just one. Maybe you don't understand that, do you?" "No," said Kay, and to slow the businessman down, who had been speaking too fast, he laid his hand on the businessman's to reassure him. "But I'd like just to ask you to speak a little more slowly. These are many very important things to me, and I can't follow exactly what you're saying." "You're quite right to remind me of that," said the businessman. "You are new to all this, a junior. Your trial is 6 months old, isn't it? Yes, I've heard about it. Such a new case, but I've already thought all these things through countless times. To me, they're the most obvious things in the world. You must be glad your trial has already progressed so far, aren't you?" asked Kay. He did not wish to ask directly how the businessman's affairs stood, but received no clear answer anyway. "Yes, I've been working at my trial for 5 years now," said the businessman, as his head sank. "That's no small achievement." Then he was silent for a while. Kay listened to hear whether Lenny was on her way back. On the other hand, he did not want her to come back too soon, as he still had many questions to ask, and did not want her to find him in the intimate discussion with the businessman. But on the other hand, it irritated him that she stayed so long with the lawyer when Kay was there, much longer than she needed to give him his soup. "I still remember it exactly," the businessman began again, and Kay immediately gave him his full attention. "When my case was as old as yours is now, I only had this one lawyer at the time, and I wasn't very satisfied with him. Now I'll find out everything," thought Kay, nodding vigorously, as if he could thereby encourage the businessman to say everything worth knowing. "My case," the businessman continued, "didn't move on at all. There were some hearings that took place, and I went to every one of them, collected materials, handed all my business books to the court, which I later found was entirely unnecessary. I ran back and forth to the lawyer, and he submitted various documents to the court, too." "Various documents?" asked Kay. "Yes, that's right," said the businessman. "That's very important for me," said Kay. "In my case, he's still working on the first set of documents. He still hasn't done anything. I see now that he's been neglecting me quite disgracefully. There can be lots of good reasons why the first documents still aren't ready," said the businessman. "And anyway, it turned out later on that the ones he submitted for me were entirely worthless. I even read one of them myself. One of the officials at the court was very helpful. It was very learned, but it didn't actually say anything." Most of all, there were lots of Latin, which I can't understand, then pages and pages of general appeals to the court, then lots of flattery for particular officials. They weren't named, these officials, but anyone familiar with the court must have been able to guess who they were. Then there was self-praise by the lawyer, where he humiliated himself to the court in a way that was downright dog-like. And then endless investigations of cases from the past, which were supposed to be similar to mine, although, as far as I was able to follow them, these investigations had been carried out very carefully. Now, I don't mean to criticize the lawyer's work with all of this, and the documents I read was only one of many, but even so, and this is something I will say, at that time I couldn't see any progress in my trial at all. "And what sort of progress had you been hoping for?" asked Kay. "That's a very sensible question," said the businessman, with a smile. "It's only very rare that you see any progress in these proceedings at all." "But I didn't know that then. I'm a businessman, much more in those days than now. I wanted to see some tangible progress. It should have all been moving to some conclusion, or at least should have been moving on in some way according to these rules, instead of which there were just more hearings, and most of them went through the same things anyway. I had all the answers off pat, like in a church service. There were messengers from the court coming to me at work several times a week, or they came to me at home, or anywhere else they could find me, and that was very disturbing, of course, but at least now things are better in that respect. It's much less disturbing when they contact you by telephone. And rumors about my trial even started to spread among some of the people I do business with, and especially my relations, so I was being made to suffer in many different ways. But there was still not the slightest sign that even the first hearing would take place soon, so I went to the lawyer and complained about it. He explained it all to me at length, but refused to do anything I asked for. No one has any influence on the way the trial proceeds, he said. To try and insist on it in any of the documents submitted, like I was asking, was simply unheard of, and would do harm to both him and me. I thought to myself, what this lawyer can't or won't do, any lawyer will. So I looked round for other lawyers, and before you say anything, none of them asked for a definite date for the main trial. None of them got one, and anyway, apart from one exception, which I'll talk about in a minute, it really isn't possible that one thing this lawyer didn't mislead me about, but besides, I had no reason to regret turning to other lawyers. Perhaps you've already heard how Dr. Hould talks about the petty lawyers. He probably made them sound very contemptible to you. And he's right, they are contemptible. But when he talks about them and compares them with himself and his colleagues, there's a small error running through what he says. And just for your interest, I'll tell you about it. When he talks about the lawyers he mixes with, he sets them apart by calling them the great lawyers. That's wrong. Anyone can call himself great if he wants to, of course. But in this case, only the usage of the court can make that distinction, you see. The court says that besides the petty lawyers, there are also minor lawyers and great lawyers. This one and his colleagues are only minor lawyers, and the difference in rank between them and the great lawyers, who I've only ever heard about and never seen, is incomparably greater than between the minor lawyers and the despised petty lawyers. "The great lawyers?" asked Kay. "Who are they, then? How do you contact them?" "You've never heard about them, then?" said the businessman. "There's hardly anyone who's been accused who doesn't spend a lot of time daydreaming about the great lawyers once he's heard about them. It's best if you don't let yourself be misled in that way. I don't know who the great lawyers are. and there's probably no way of contacting them. I don't know of any case I can talk about with certainty where they've taken any part. They do defend a lot of people, but you can't get a hold of them by your own efforts. They only defend those who want to defend. And I don't suppose they ever take on cases that haven't already got past the lower courts. Anyway, it's best not to think about them, as if you do it makes the discussion with other lawyers, all their advice, and all they do manage to achieve seem so unpleasant and useless. I had that experience myself, just wanted to throw everything away and lay at home in bed and hear nothing more about it. But that, of course, would be the stupidest thing you could do, and you wouldn't be left in peace in bed for very long either. So you weren't thinking about the great lawyers at that time? Asked Kay. Not for very long, said the businessman, and smiled again. You can't forget about them entirely, I'm afraid, especially in the night when these thoughts come so easily, but I wanted immediate results in those days, so I went to the petty lawyers. Well, look at you, sat huddled together, called Lenny, as she came back with the dish and stood in the hallway. They were indeed sat close together. If either of them turned his head even slightly, it would have knocked against the others. The businessman was not only very small, but also sat hunched down, so that Kay was also forced to bend down low if he wanted to hear everything. Not quite yet, called out Kay, to turn Lenny away, his hand still resting on the businessman's hand, twitching with impatience. He wanted me to tell him about my trial, said the businessman to Lenny. Carry on then, carry on, she said. She spoke to the businessman with affection, but at the same time with condescension. Kay did not like that. He had begun to learn that the man was of some value after all. He had experience at least, and he was willing to share it. Lenny was probably wrong about him. He watched her in irritation as Lenny now took the candle from the businessman's hand, which he had been holding on to all this time, wiped his hand with her apron, and then knelt beside him to scratch off some wax that had dripped from the candle onto his trousers. You were about to tell me about the petty lawyers, said Kay, shoving Lenny's hand away with no further comment. What's wrong with you today? Asked Lenny, tapped him gently, and carried on with what she had been doing. Yes, the petty lawyers, said the businessman, putting his hand to his brow as if thinking hard. Kay wanted to help him and said, You wanted immediate results, and so went to the petty lawyers. Yes, that's right, and the businessman did not continue with what he'd been saying. Maybe he doesn't want to speak about it in front of Lenny, thought Kay, suppressing his impatience to hear the rest straight away, and stopped trying to press him. Have you told him I'm here? He asked Lenny. Course I have, she said. He's waiting for you. Leave Block alone now. You can talk to Block later. He'll still be here. Kay still hesitated. You'll still be here? He asked the businessman, wanting to hear the answer from him, and not wanting Lenny to speak about the businessman as if he weren't there. He was full of secret resentment towards Lenny today. And once more it was only Lenny who answered. He often sleeps here. He sleeps here? Exclaimed Kay. He had thought the businessman would just wait there for him while he quickly settled his business with the lawyer, and then they would leave together to discuss everything thoroughly and undisturbed. Yes, said Lenny. Not everyone's like you, Joseph, allowed to see the lawyer at any time you like. Don't even seem surprised that the lawyer, despite being ill, still receives you at 11 o'clock at night. You take it far too much for granted what your friends do for you. Well, your friends, or at least I do, we like to do things for you. I don't want or need any more thanks than that you're fond of me. Fond of you, thought Kay at first, and only then it occurred to him. Well, yes, I'm fond of her. None the less, what he said, forgetting all the rest, was, He receives me because I am his client. If I needed anyone else's help, I'd have to beg and show gratitude whenever I do anything. He's really nasty today, isn't he?" Lenny asked the businessman. "Now it's me who's not here," thought Kay, and nearly lost his temper with the businessman when, with the same rudeness as Lenny, he said, "The lawyer also has other reasons to receive him. His case is much more interesting than mine, and it's only in its early stages, too. It probably hasn't progressed very far, so the lawyer still likes to deal with him. That'll all change later on." "Yeah, yeah," said Lenny, looking at the businessman and laughing. "He doesn't have talk," she said, turning to face Kay. "You can't believe a word he says. He's as talkative as he is sweet. Maybe that's why the lawyer can't stand him. At least, he only sees him when he is in the right mood. I've already tried to change that, but it's impossible. Just think, there are times when I tell him Block's here and he doesn't receive him until 3 days later. And if Block isn't on the spot when he's called, then everything's lost and it all has to start all over again. That's why I let Block sleep here. It wouldn't be the first time Dr. Hood was wanted to see him in the night. So now Block is ready for that. Sometimes when he knows Block is still here, he'll even change his mind about letting him in to see him." Kay looked questioningly at the businessman. The latter nodded, and although he had spoken quite openly with Kay earlier, seemed to be confused with shame as he said, "Yes, later on you become very dependent on your lawyer." "He's only pretending to mind," said Lenny. "He likes to see Perilli. He often said so." She went over to a little door and shoved it open. "Do you want to see his bedroom?" she asked Kay. Kay went over to the low, windowless room and looked in from the doorway. The room contained a narrow bed which filled it completely, so that to get into bed you would need to climb over the bedpost. At the head of the bed there was a niche in the wall where, fastidiously tidy, stood a candle and a bottle of ink and a pin with a bundle of papers which were probably to do with the trial. "You sleep in the maid's room?" asked Kay, as he went back to the businessman. "Linny's let me have it," answered the businessman. "It has many advantages." Kay looked long at him. This first impression of the businessman had perhaps not been right. He had experience at his trial, had already lasted a long time, but he had paid a very heavy price for this experience. Kay was suddenly unable to bear the sight of the businessman any longer. "Bring him to bed, then," he called out to Lenny, who seemed to understand him. For himself, he wanted to go to the lawyer and, by dismissing him, free himself from not only the lawyer but also from Lenny and the businessman. But before he had reached the door the businessman spoke to him gently. "Excuse me, sir," he said, and Kay looked round crossly. "You've forgotten your promise," said the businessman, stretching his hand out to Kay, imploring from where he sat. "You were going to tell me a secret." "That is true," said Kay, as he glanced at Lenny, who was watching him carefully, to check on her. "So listen, it's hardly a secret now anyway. I'm going to see the lawyer now to sack him." "He's sacking him!" yelled the businessman, and he jumped up from his chair and round with the kitchen with his arms in the air. He kept on shouting, "He's sacking his lawyer!" Lenny tried to rush at Kay, but the businessman got in the way so that she shoved him away with her fist. Then, still with her hands balled into fist, she ran after Kay, who, however, had been given a long start. He was already inside the lawyer's room by the time Lenny caught up with him. He had almost closed the door behind himself, but Lenny held the door open with her foot, grabbed his arm, and tried to pull him back. But he put such pressure on her wrist, with a sigh she was forced to release him. She did not dare go into the room straight away, and Kay locked the door with the key. "I've been waiting for you a very long time," said the lawyer from his bed. He had been reading something by the light of a candle, but now he laid it on the bedside table and put his glasses on, looking at Kay sharply through them. Instead of apologizing, Kay said, "I'll be leaving again soon." As he had not apologized, the lawyer ignored what Kay said and replied, "I won't let you in this late again next time." "I find that quite acceptable," said Kay. The lawyer looked at him quizzically. "Sit down," he said. "As you wish," said Kay, drawing a chair up to the bedside table and sitting down. "It seemed to me that you locked the door," said the lawyer. "Yes," said Kay. "It was because of Lenny." He had no intention of letting anyone off lightly, but the lawyer asked him, was she being importunate again? "Importunate?" asked Kay. "Yes," said the lawyer, laughing as he did so, had a fit of coughing, and then, once it had passed, began to laugh again. "I'm sure you must have noticed how importunate she can be sometimes," he said, and patted Kay's hand, which Kay had rested on the bedside table, and which he now snatched back. "You don't attach much importance to it, then?" said the lawyer, when Kay was silent. "So much the better. Otherwise I might have needed to apologize to you. It is a peculiarity of Lenny's. I've long since forgiven her for it, and I wouldn't be talking of it now if you hadn't locked the door just now. Anyway, perhaps I should at least explain this peculiarity of hers to you. But you seem rather disturbed the way you're looking at me, and so that's why I'll do it. This peculiarity of hers consists in this: Lenny finds most of the accused attractive. She attaches herself to each of them, loves each of them, even seems to be loved by each of them. Then she sometimes entertains me by telling me about them, when I allow her to. I am not so astonished by all of this as you seem to be. If you look at them in the right way, the accused really can be attractive quite often. But that is a remarkable and to some extent scientific phenomenon. Being indicted does not cause any clear, precisely definable change in a person's appearance, of course. But it's not like with other legal matters. Most of them remain in their usual way of life, and if they have a good lawyer looking after them, the trial doesn't get in their way. But there are none the less those who have experience in these matters, who can look at a crowd, however big, and tell you which among them is facing a charge. How can they do that, you will ask? My answer will not please you. It is simply that those who are facing a charge are the most attractive. It cannot be their guilt that makes them attractive, as not all of them are guilty. At least that's what I, as a lawyer, have to say. Or nor can it be the proper punishment that has made them attractive, as not all of them are punished. So it can only be that the proceedings leveled against them take some kind of hold of them. Whatever the reason, some of these attractive people are indeed very attractive. But all of them are attractive, even Block, pitiful worm that he is. As the lawyer finished what he was saying, Kay was fully in control of himself. He had even nodded conspicuously at his last few words in order to confirm to him the view he had already formed, that the lawyer was trying to confuse him, as he always did, by making general and irrelevant observations, and thus distract him from the main question of what he was actually doing for Kay's trial. The lawyer must have noticed that Kay was offering him more resistance than before, as he became silent, giving Kay the chance to speak himself. And then, as Kay also remained silent, he asked, "Do you have a particular reason for coming to see me today?" "Yes," said Kay, putting his hand up to slightly shade his eyes from the light of the candle so that he could see the lawyer better. I wanted to tell you that I'm withdrawing my representation from you with immediate effect." "Do I understand you rightly?" asked the lawyer, as he half raised himself in his bed and supported himself with one hand on the pillow. "I think you do," said Kay, sitting stiffly upright, as if waiting in ambush. "Well, we can certainly discuss this plan of yours," said the lawyer after a pause. "It's not a plan any more." "That may be," said the lawyer, "but we still mustn't rush anything." He used the word "we" as if he had no intention of letting Kay go free, and as if, even if he could no longer represent him, he could still at least continue as his adviser. "Nothing is being rushed," said Kay, standing slowly up and going behind his chair. "Everything has been well thought out, and probably even for too long. The decision is final." "Then allow me to say a few words," said the lawyer, throwing the bed cover to one side and sitting on the edge of the bed. His naked, white-haired legs shivered in the cold. He asked Kay to pass him a blanket from the couch. Kay passed him the blanket and said, "You are running the risk of catching cold for no reason." "The circumstances are important enough," said the lawyer, as he wrapped the bed cover around the top half of his body, and then the blanket around his legs. "Your uncle is my friend, and in the course of time I've become fond of you as well. I admit that quite openly. There's nothing in that for me to be ashamed of." It was very unwelcome for Kay to hear the old man speak in this touching way, as it forced him to explain himself more fully, which he would rather have avoided, and he was aware that it also confused him, even though it could never make him reverse his decision. "Thank you for feeling so friendly towards me," he said. "And I also realize how deeply involved you've been in my case, as deeply as for yourself, and to bring as much advantage as possible to me. Nonetheless, I have recently come to the conviction that it is not enough. I would naturally never attempt, considering that you are so much older and more experienced than I am, to convince you of my opinion. If I have ever unintentionally done so, then I beg your forgiveness, but, as you have just said yourself, the circumstances are important enough, and it is my belief that my trial needs to be approached with much more vigor than it has been so far." "I see," said the lawyer, "you've become impatient." "I am not impatient," said Kay, with some irritation, and he stopped paying so much attention to his choice of words. "When I first came here with my uncle, you probably noticed I wasn't greatly concerned about my case, and if I wasn't reminded of it by force, as it were, I would forget about it completely. But my uncle insisted I should allow you to represent me, and I did so as to favor to him. I could have expected the case to be less of a burden than it has been, as the point of taking on a lawyer is that he should take on some of its weight. But that what actually happened was the opposite. Before the trial was never such a worry for me as it has been since you've been representing me. When I was by myself I never did anything about my case. I was hardly aware of it. But then, once there was someone representing me, everything was set for something to happen. I was always, without cease, waiting for you to do something, getting more and more tense. But you did nothing. I did get some information about the court from you that I probably could not have got anywhere else. But that can't be enough when the trial, supposedly in secret, is getting closer and closer to me." Kay had pushed the chair away and stood erect, his hands in his pockets of his frock coat. "After a certain point in the proceedings," said the lawyer quietly and calmly, "nothing new of any importance ever happens. So many litigants at the same stage in their trial have stood before me just like you are now, and spoken in the same way. "Then these other litigants," said Kay, "have all been right, just as I am." "That does not show that I am not." "I wasn't trying to show that you were mistaken," said the lawyer, "but I wanted to add that I expected better judgment from you than from the others, especially as I've given you more insight into the workings of the court and my own activities than I normally do. And now I'm forced to accept that, despite everything, you have too little trust in me. You don't make it easy for me." How the lawyer was humiliating himself to Kay. He was showing no regard for the dignity of his position, which on this point must have been at its most sensitive. And why did he do that? He did seem to be very busy as a lawyer as well as a rich man. Neither the loss of income nor the loss of a client could have been of much importance to him in themselves. He was moreover unwell, and should have been thinking of passing work on to others. And despite all that, he held on tightly to Kay. Why? Was it something personal for his uncle's sake, or did he really see Kay's case as one that was exceptional and hoped to be able to distinguish himself with it, either for Kay's sake or, and this possibility could never be excluded, for his friends at the court? It was not possible to learn anything by looking at him. Even though Kay was scrutinizing him quite brazenly, it could almost be supposed he was deliberately hiding his thoughts, as he waited to see what effect his words would have. But he clearly deemed Kay's silence to be favorable for himself, and he continued, "You will have noticed the size of my office, but that I don't employ any staff to help me. That used to be quite different. There was a time when several young lawyers were working for me, but now I work alone. This is partly to do with changes in the way I do business, and that I concentrate nowadays more and more on matters such as your own case, and partly to do with the ever deeper understanding that I acquire from these legal matters. I found that I could never let anyone else deal with this sort of work unless I wanted to harm both the client and the job I had taken on. But the decision to do all the work myself had its obvious result. I was forced to turn almost everyone away who asked me to represent them, and could only accept those I was especially interested in. Well, there are enough creatures who leap up at every crumb I throw down, and they're not so very far away. Most importantly, I became ill from overwork. But despite that, I don't regret my decision. Quite possibly I should have turned more cases away than I did. But it did turn out to be entirely necessary for me to devote myself fully to the cases I did take on, and the successful results showed it was worth it. I once read a description of the difference between representing someone in ordinary legal matters and in legal matters of this sort, and the writer expressed it very well. This is what he said: "Some lawyers lead their clients on a thread until judgment is passed, but there are others who immediately lift their clients onto their shoulders and carry them all the way to the judgment and beyond. That's just how it is." But it was quite true when I said I never regret all this work. But if, as in your case, they are so fully misunderstood, well, then, I come very close to regretting it. All this talking did more to make Kay impatient than to persuade him. From the way the lawyer was speaking, Kay thought he could hear what he could expect if he gave in. The delays and excuses would have begin again. Reports of how the documents were progressing, how the mood of the court officials had improved, as well as all the enormous difficulties, in short, all that he had heard so many times before, would be brought out against even more fully. He would try to mislead Kay with hopes that were never specified, and to make him suffer with threats that were never clear. He had to put a stop to that. So he said, "What will you undertake on my behalf if you continue to represent me?" The lawyer quietly accepted this insult question, and answered, "I shall continue with what I've already been doing for you." "That's just what I thought," said Kay, "and now you don't need to say another word. I will make one more attempt," said the lawyer, as if whatever had been making Kay so annoyed was affecting him too. "You see, I have the impression that you have not only misjudged the legal assistance I have given you, but also that misjudgment has led you to behave in this way. You seem, although you are the accused, to have been treated too well, or, to put it a better way, handled with neglect, with apparent neglect. Even that has its reasons. It is often better to be in chains than to be free. But I would like to show you how other defendants are treated. Perhaps you will succeed in learning something from them. What I will do is I will call Block in, unlock the door, and sit down here beside the bedside table. Be glad to," said Kay, and did as the lawyer suggested. He was always ready to learn something new, but to make sure of himself for any event, he added, "But you do realize that you are no longer to be my lawyer, don't you?" "Yes," said the lawyer, "but you can still change your mind today if you want to." He lay back down in the bed, pulled the quilt up to his chin, and turned to face the wall. Then he rang. Linny appeared almost the moment he had done so. She looked hurriedly at Kay and the lawyer to try and find out what had happened. She seemed to be reassured by the sight of Kay sitting calmly at the lawyer's bed. She smiled and nodded to Kay. Kay looked blankly back at her. "Fetch Block," said the lawyer. But instead of going to fetch him, Linny just went to the door and called out, "Block! To the lawyer!" Then, probably because the lawyer had turned his face to the wall and was paying no attention, she slipped in behind Kay's chair. From then on she bothered him by leaning forward over the back of the chair, or, albeit very tenderly and carefully, she would run her hands through his hair and over his cheeks. Kay eventually tried to stop her by taking hold of one hand, and after some resistance Linny let him keep hold of it. Block came as soon as he was called, but he remained standing in the doorway and seemed to be wondering whether he should enter or not. He raised his eyebrows and lowered his head, as if listening to find out whether the order to attend the lawyer would be repeated. Kay could have encouraged to enter, but he had decided to make a final break not only with the lawyer, but with everything in his home, so he kept himself motionless. Linny was also silent. Block noticed that at least no one was chasing him away, and on tiptoe he entered the room. His face was tense, his hands were clenched behind his back. He left the door open in case he needed to go back again. Kay did not even glance at him. He looked instead only at the thick quilt, under which the lawyer could not be seen, as he had squeezed up very close to the wall. Then his voice was heard. "Block here?" he asked. Block had already crept some way into the room, but this question seemed to give him first a shove in the breast, and then another in the back. He seemed about to fall, but remained standing, deeply bowed, and said, "At your service, sir." "What do you want?" asked the lawyer. "You've come at a bad time." "Wasn't I summoned?" asked Block, more to himself than the lawyer. He held his hand in front of himself as protection, and would have been ready to run away at any moment. "You were summoned, but you have still come at it at a bad time." Then after a pause he added, "You always come at a bad time." When the lawyer started speaking, Block had stopped looking at the bed, but stared rather into one of the corners, just listening, as if the light from the speaker were brighter than Block could bear to look at. But it was also difficult for him to listen, as the lawyer was speaking into the wall, and speaking quickly and quietly. "Would you like me to go away again, sir?" asked Block. Will you hear now? Stay! It was as if the lawyer had not done as Block had wanted, but instead threatened him with a stick, as now Block really began to shake. "I went to see," said the lawyer, "the third judge yesterday, a friend of mine, and slowly brought the conversation round to the subject of you. Do you want to know what he said?" "Oh, yes, please," said Block. The lawyer did not answer immediately, so Block repeated his request and lowered his head as if about to kneel down, but then Kay spoke to him. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. Lenny had wanted to stop him from calling out, and so he took hold of her other hand. It was not love that made him squeeze it,